Okay, right off the bat, you can tell, looking at the image that we used for the poster, that it's about helicopters. Well, the fact is that some people in the library and archives were asking if maybe they could attend so that they could get some in-depth study of helicopter aerodynamics. This isn't that. This is helicopter aerodynamics for site majors. So the idea is that some people come forward with the idea, why don't we have supersonic helicopters? Why don't we have helicopters that are massive in size? And in fact, there have been some misconceptions floating around the internet. Some people sent me some idea of a helicopter that was the size of a hotel where you could book rooms. And some of you might have seen it a couple of years ago. It circulated. It looked pretty plausible, but it was mostly Photoshop. Well, there's reasons why helicopters don't get too big, although don't the Russians. And there are reasons why they don't get too fast, and there's reasons why they don't do everything. So that's kind of what this is for. This picture actually is a bad thing happening. This is an Apache, and the airflow here is recirculating through the rotor heads. This doesn't provide lift. This actually just provides circulation. So this is a helicopter in trouble, but it makes a beautiful picture. So let's take a look at some of the basics. Well, first off, this thing's been around since the 70s. Who hasn't seen this picture? Helicopter pilots are different at Harry Reasoner. We've got that in the back. The fact is that you get a little nervous flying them by nature because things aren't exactly as steady as they would be in a fixed-wing aircraft. But there's an impression out there, sometimes fostered by helicopter pilots, that helicopters are inherently harder to fly and harder to maintain. This is BS. This is us just trying to pump ourselves up. Helicopters are actually very stable platforms. Aerodynamically, they're wonderful. And if you're shooting something like an instrument approach, wouldn't it be nice to be able to, all the pilots out there, wouldn't it be nice to be able to go from initial approach fix to final approach fix at 90 knots? Wouldn't that be nice? We do that all the time. It's not so much of a hassle. Imagine the poor single seat guy, Jim's not here, trying to get in the penetration, the IAF, all the way into the runway, and he's got no co-pilot, and he's doing it at 200 knots. For helicopters, the pace is more relaxed until something goes wrong. And no, it doesn't go wrong all the time. It's just you have to be on guard for it. So this image is probably a little bit overdone, but we love it anyway, and you see it all the time. We are different. Helicopter pilots do have a slightly different technique. You can see it, but most of you already know it. How Helo pilots see themselves. Did anybody remember Airwolf from the 1980s? Yeah, this was kind of Jan Michael Vincent before the sauce got to him. But the helicopter in there is just a beautiful Eurocopter. I've forgotten what the heck it is.
Bell 220.
Bell 220 all dressed up. There you go. And the idea was it was a supersonic helicopter armed with the latest weapons. Kind of a cool idea, but it just doesn't work. And there's a couple of reasons for that. This was the image of helicopter pilots in the 80s that I got to ride the coattails on. That and Blue Thunder and a couple of other things. But the reality is that these days, it's kind of mixed with the public perception of helicopters. If you look at the bar graph, this is what helicopters do in the movies. The yellow part is explode. And this is why someone asked me, well, do helicopters go supersonic? I say, yes. At the moment of explosion, almost every part of a helicopter goes supersonic. Until then, no, of course they don't. There are limitations to what a helicopter can do. But they do fly. They do fly. Helicopters obey the four forces of flight. Without lift, they don't go up. Without thrust, of course, that's tilting the rotor, you don't go forward. But they are remarkably sturdy if you do them right. Now, these smaller helicopters, admittedly, those are a handful. When we learned in the Navy, we were only learning on jet rangers. And those were beautiful little aircraft, but they were small. To handle one of the even smaller Robinsons, I've understood, is actually a little bit more difficult. But, you know, once you master it, you master it. And has anybody ever balanced a broom on their hand? If you can do that, you can probably hover. It's just going to take, if you've got that sense of balance and that sense of reading directional trends, that's what hovering is. So many a fixed winger is humbled at first when the helicopter the pilot hands him the controls and says, go at it and hover. But within 2 hours, he'd be fine. A fixed winger who gets competent instruction is going to be able to hover that helicopter and he'll just have a great boost. So at first it seems difficult, but it's not too bad, and they really do fly. Having said that, why are they so cool? Because they hover. Helicopters' flexibility comes from the fact that they can stay still, they can land still. Their footprint, landing, is scarcely bigger than the helicopter itself. No bigger, if you believe the movies. So if you can get the helicopter down at the right rates, at the right area, and you aren't bothered too much by the weather or other factors, the helicopter goes almost anywhere. That caveat is coming up, you know those. But the helicopter can land vertically. Everybody in the fixed-wing community, in the Navy, where I spent my time until retirement, was patting themselves on the back for a number of carrier landings. I had hundreds upon hundreds of carrier landings. I never saw what the big deal was. You just move in, slide over, and set the helicopter down. It wasn't so hard. So there was a movement afoot in 1984 that I made in HS4, where I did my primary sea tour, to actually have Centurion patches for helicopter pilots. My skippers at the time, Bob Hansen and Steve Ahrens, wisely shut me down and said, no, you're just going to anger all the fixed-wing people if you wear those patches. I said, okay, there you go. So the landing is fairly easy for a helicopter pilot. The takeoff is even easier if you can do it. In the first takeoff of the day, feels like $1 million. Helicopters do this, and that's where their beauty is. Having said that, notice also right here at the ends of the wings, the rotary wing does act like a wing. Small amounts of vortex are expected, and those destroy lift. This is a hover in-ground effect. You can see the downwash kind of bouncing off the ground and moving away. Those of you who are raw aerodynamicists will say, all right, that's all going to be low-pressure, high-speed air underneath. Yes, but the flow of air is also being pushed down, and so you get that Newtonian lift, if you will, that's keeping the helicopter in the air. It's kind of a neat thing. I hope my batteries haven't gone now. We actually might have. The laser burst might have done it. One moment. But if you look at it, it's a wing where the flow is, of course, rotary, and that means that you can get 400 plus miles an hour at the tip. But also you've got a downdraft, which changes a little bit of the angle of attack. And that downdraft is the induced flow that's going through the rotor disc itself. So while you have a nominal angle of attack that looks like this, right here, in reality, the blade itself, which can be a symmetrical airfoil on most helicopters, it'll be a symmetrical airfoil, can actually go this direction to the actual relative wind. Well, the real relative wind with the downwash is this one, and that's why there's limits to how much you can get out of your rotor blade, in particular the retreating rotor blade, which we'll get to later. So it's just a wing. It does twist a little bit from root to tip, so that at the tip you don't need quite the angle of attack that you need at the root. And that means that, of course, in normal circumstances, you get a whole lot of lift without going anywhere, because the actual rotor system is providing all of it for you. But it works better when you are flying forward. Let's go ahead and hit next on that one. Because they're wings, they stall, but also because they're wings, they want to lift up by themselves. Make sense? So they're attached here to the rotor hub and allowed to flap a little bit and allowed to go up and down without tearing up the root. So they're allowed to actually go up and down a little bit within limits. And there's bushings here which are dampened so that you can actually protect that flapping from hitting the actual bearing surface. And they're also allowed to lead and drag, or hunt and drag, what they call it, so that you can actually get those rotors to give a little bit as they rotate around. This is to get rid of asymmetric lift on the disc, so that you're not always flexing your blades. Although there are rotor systems now where they're so sturdy that you can actually just plain flex the blades. Let's hit down again. Harry, this will probably happen a lot. Juan de Lasquerra, anybody remember him? Let's hit down again. Up one more time. I think we lost Juan. Yeah. Here he is. He's the guy who was the inventor of the auto gyro, and he figured that, if you turn the spinning blades into a wing, you get a lot of flexibility, and you can use the sort of inertia of those wings to let yourself down easily at the end of a long flight, kind of stall into a pinwheel approach, much like your paper helicopters. Well, that's marvelous. This system he designed was perfected more or less by the Fock company, and also by Igor Sikorsky, so that most blade hubs look like that now. Let's hit it again. And most blade hubs will be attached to the controls via this, which is the stationary Swash blade. That's just a big plate attached to your flight controls, moves up and down. And it will also tilt. When it moves up and down, that's collective pitch. That means you use your left end to bring up the whole pitch of all the blades, and ideally you'll take off straight up if you were steady. And this also tilts so that you can actually move sideways or back and forth. The whole rotor disc tilts. And the helicopter is just attached to that rotor disc, hanging from it, and you can go backwards, forwards, whatever you have. So that rotating swash plate, or this stationary swash plate, is what actually lifts and tilts. The rotating swash plate is the one attached to all the pitch change links, these things. And those are attached to the blades. And we'll take a look at that in the next slide. So it looks complex, but in reality it's just there so that this blade, this swash plate, sits the rotating part on top of it, and you can actually tilt the whole blade in flight. These are swash plates moving. This one's in steady state. This one's actually got negative pitch on it because it's lowered the pitch change links, which are attached to the blade. And you can see that's rotating. That's the theory. This is rotating, and that's stationary. And this one is tilted a little bit. So you can see the blades are changing pitch as it goes around. Changing the negative here, and then positive over here. So someone's actually moving that direction by tilting. And the weird thing that Sikorsky discovered is, you know, when you tilt it, one particular blade, the actual effect, phase lag, or they call it what is this, gyroscopic precession, the actual effect is felt about 90 degrees later. So that was the one thing he had to feel. At first, when he hooked it up normally, he'd go stick forward, he'd travel left. I said, that's not right. He'd travel left, he'd go backwards. He'd go stick back, he'd go right. I said, we can fix this. So most helicopters have a mixer switch, or mixer system, where the stick forward moves the helicopter forward, even though the pitch change won't be exactly in the forward area. Next. Thanks so much. Well, here's your collective. That's the lever on the left side. And in most modern helicopters, it's also tied to the throttle. So you don't have to worry about it. But in the old days, and with some basic helicopters, while you raise the collective, you want to also twist on the throttle so that your rotor RPM is kept relatively constant. These days, it's usually tied to the governor. All of the helicopters, so all you had to do was lift the collective, and then the throttle went up, and it kept your RPM steady. The cyclic is your stick, so forward houses get bigger, backward houses get smaller, the nose goes up. You can even do a loop in a helicopter, at least once, but it's just not recommended for most. Most of them, if you unload the head or if you put too much load on upside down, the head isn't held on securely enough to do that. But there are some, if you see them in the air show, the Red Bull helicopter and some other, well, completely aerobatic. And the Lynx, the UK Lynx is wonderful that way. So cyclic and collective, this stick acts like any other stick. That's why any pilot can get in there. I've got 2 hours with a non-nervous pilot. He's going to be able to hover, land, do almost everything. You know, not perfect, not as well as I could. But next. The controls don't look much different, and neither really is the principle. All you really have is the heading to control, and then you move by bank, just like a regular helicopter or regular aircraft. The anti-torque rotor, though, why the rotor? That just keeps you straight. So most helicopters, because this is an efficient way of doing it, most helicopters have the tail rotor because it provides a balance that will allow you to use your rudder pedals to turn the nose. Well, what a wonderful thing that is. If you are good at holding your heading with the rudder pedals, you can hover, turn about, do anything you need. You can loop where you need to be. And if you're looking far enough ahead, it can be remarkably steady, even a small helicopter. That tail rotor now sometimes is a tail fan, if you've seen those, with a fan in the fairing, or even a blower, so that there's some that look like they have no tail rotor at all, but they're actually blowing a good deal of force out the back. Those are what used to be the Hughes, the MDs with no tail rotor. They work well within limitations. You can back them right into the trees, and you don't crash. What a concept. Go ahead. Now, why do a tail rotor at all? The Russians, this is their Hokum aircraft, or have it. No, this is Hokum. The Russians will frequently use these coaxial rotors, and all they need to do is put the slightest amount of differential braking or speed on the rotor system, and that can turn your heading as well. But it comes at a cost that most American engineers aren't willing to pay. It looks a little bit complex up here in the rotor hub. That's one thing. And two, even though you can go remarkably fast with these things, they're still subject to speed limitations that are not related to the lack of the tail rotor. The good news is, though, if you get a counter-rotating propeller head like this, you can lift enormous amounts of torque without having to lose any of that power to the tail rotor. And there's no shaft. And this part is less vulnerable. So this is a remarkable thing. It's been around since the late 80s, early 90s. It really works well, but there's reasons why we don't bother with it.
They need to separate the sets of propellers so they don't get too much turbulence in between and lose the effect.
Very much so. You know how a biplane, you don't have the wings right next to each other? You need to be able to have low pressure airflow go through both sets. And that can be a problem. Because remember these articulated hubs here, we talked about them flapping and leading and lagging. If one flaps one way and the other flaps the other way, which is normal, you have to look out for that. So there has to be a certain amount of space there, or else you can mix rotor systems, which is considered bad.
Are they independently controlled, or does the cyclic and the other two?
The collective controls them collectively, but when you hit the rudder pedals, then they're separately controlled so that one of them is allowed to have more torque effect than the other, and you can actually move it. The Russians love this system. They say it isn't so good for fighting work, but it is good for most things. And in high forward speeds, this is still very, according to them, stable. I've never flown one. Now we've done this too. I'd hit next on this one, but we don't like the coaxial hubs as much. This is the kind of Husky from the 1960s, and they called it the Mixmaster for obvious reasons. So here's two-bladed rotor systems, kind of intertwined. They can't flap on top of each other. It won't. You can put a lot of power on. They won't hit each other, but only by the grace of a mixing unit, which you don't want to have go away. Right? So if you get hit in that thing, yes, the blades will hit each other. It's unrecoverable. But there is no tail rotor. You can get most of your power up through that. This is Charlie Command's design, and he has, if you'll hit next again, Harry, and he has put that to good use now in a heavy lift helicopter called the K-Max. It says Vortex here, but it's really called the K-Max. And it does have a tremendous lift capability. No tail rotor. It's all straight up. And because there's no tail rotor, you can get into tight places with this. And this is being used today in the logging industry. So helicopters, remarkably flexible, but you have to want to keep it simple for obvious reasons.
Why does it have more lift than a four-blade?
You know I don't know.
What?
You know I don't know.
Okay.
I think the whole reason is just so that these two rotor systems won't require anti-torque. Right? Because one four-bladed system, you'll need a tail rotor, and that's kind of a parasite for power and a vulnerability and a maintenance issue. Remember, if you've got a tail rotor like in my H3, you've got a gearbox stepping down from the main transmission, which speeds up the RPM. And that has to be speedy because remember, the tail rotor is kind of small. And then you've got another gearbox probably at the tail rotor itself, and maybe another one in between them to rise it from the tail line. You can have 3 gearboxes and 2 sets of problems if you don't work out. Next up, so these are fun things, and this is light. It's one pilot, and that's all that's required, and it can lift a tremendous amount. So, when you move the helicopter, though, when you get moving even 10 knots, the rotary wing becomes an actual wing. It looks a lot like a regular aerodynamics diagram, doesn't it? So here comes the regular high pressure air, and it flows down through the wing instead of past it, but through the wing. The rotor disc becomes a wing. In regular hover, you've got all those burbles and you've got that air recirculation destroying lift. When you start moving, nothing's destroying your lift. You get no vortices at the rotor tips, very few anyway. So the rotor tips are actually just as efficient as the end part, and suddenly you take off forward flight with much less power. A hover takes a good amount of power. A hover out of ground effect takes a tremendous amount of power, and that's the limitation of the helicopter. In forward flight, it suddenly acts like a Cessna at about the same top speed. Go ahead. Harry, you're a savior. I wish we had more AAAs, but there it is. So a small problem is what happens when the motor quits. Well, it's a small problem, but it's a little problem. You guys saw the paper helicopter. Those blades are at an angle of attack that would have produced lift anyway. So if you reverse the airflow and you lower your collector enough, you will drop into enough high pressure air that the air will then reverse and still keep your rotors turning. Provided you didn't lose the rotor RPM, which will kill you, you can actually keep flying on the way down, kind of like a glide. Now, let's hit next again. Auto rotation is a wild ride, and it goes down, all right, and the one more, back up if you would, and the glide ratio can be alarming to a lot of folks. Alan Meganson was once told, oh yeah, you can expect it to be a gentle glide. It's not gentle. There is a kind of a plummeting feeling to a heavy helicopter in auto rotation. But at the bottom, all that inertia in your rotor system is still there. And if you've got a fairly robust rotor system, even with a heavy helicopter, all you have to do then is change the collective pitch and trade that inertia off for all of that cushioning at the bottom. And it actually works. It really does. So a lot of helicopter pilots, if they've got a spot to be in, they'll save the whole helicopter, not just themselves. A lot of people in the movies, they make it look like every auto rotation is a controlled crash. Nah, sometimes the helicopter comes out just fine. But you have to be on the lookout for a landing spot, just like a fixed wing pilot is. Now look at the next one, if you would, and you'll see that depending on how much forward airspeed you get, it really does look like a glide. So here's someone who loses their engine high and fast, and they can have a glide slope like this, and then they'll flare at the bottom just like a regular aircraft would, and that will make the rotor system speed up. Well, if the rotor system speeds up, you get more inertia, and within, you want to keep it within limits. You don't want the rotor system to fly apart. But at the bottom then, you simply rock your nose over and pull collective. You trade off that excess speed, you can grease it onto the deck pretty easy. If you lose it here high, you simply have to accept, if your landing space is right there, you have to accept that you haven't got much flare. You just plug it real heavily, and then you trade it off at the bottom, and you don't have to run the flare. If you lose it low and fast, you can still swoop in and do a flare, and you're fine. But that high area is one that you want to avoid. So helicopters will not spend a great deal of time out of ground effect with low forward speed, because they don't like it. It's harder to recover in case the engines fail. And that's one reason why people say, why don't helicopters just stand forever and kind of make them surveillance posts? Well, for one thing, it takes a lot of power. For two, it's not the safest region in the world in case you get an engine failure. Let's hit it next. Yeah, we've got meetings upstairs, otherwise I'd have a loyal helper in back there as well. So, auto rotation is a glide, it really is. It just doesn't look like it when you look at it real closely. It doesn't feel like it. So next, one more time. Now, why would we have thought of this in the first place? Well, some of you have already seen maple seeds that go down by themselves, and you've seen the paper helicopters already. The fact is that that is a way of arresting descent. And I think I already mentioned this. The F-111, at one point, the capsule was designed so that there might have been a rotor system, and even an ejection seat was designed with a rotor system on it. Needlessly complex. And it takes up a little room. So parachutes were kind of given that go-ahead. But individual rotor systems and small gyrocopters, you've seen them. They were in the James Bond movie in 1967 as well. You can get a lot out of just a freewheeling blade. Next. And we use those maple seeds actually in classes too, because the kids love them. Usually you have to break them apart to be able to rotate. Why can't Helos do everything? Well, we've mentioned a couple of them. There's power limitations, etc. This is the high mountains. It's a perfect day for a helicopter. Why?
The air is cold.
Bingo. The air is cold and dense. So if you can get where the air is cold and dense, good. Now, unfortunately, you also get high. And high, the air isn't that dense. So the higher you get, the less effective your helicopters are. People were asking, what's the big deal with those poor guys trapped on, not Kilimanjaro, but Everest? The fact is, you can't get helicopters up there to get them off all the time. And when you can, you get them off one at a time, you can't land. You got to kind of just drift in close to the hill, get them onto them, and go. There's no spot to land frequently. And even if you could, you might not be able to hover to land. You might have to go in and slide it on. So there's limitations to every helicopter. This one is a particularly good one. These are the French doing it. And they will charge you if you need the rescue, as a lot of our folks do. 2,000, 4,000 euros per rescue, but some of them now have the fan and fin. So next up, so if you're lost in the Alps, they will rescue, but there it is. Now, hovering out of ground effect, they call it hoagie, is the midair hover. But take a look at this diagram. In ground effect, we notice the rotor wash moving away. Well, the rotor wash moves away, and that's low pressure air. So a lot of the rotor wash actually goes this way, and it follows the low pressure air. Thank you, Mr. Bernoulli. I think we can hit next once, I think. Yeah, there we go. It'd be a lot easier when we're remote. But so because it's following a low pressure air path, and because it wants to go where the air wants to go into low pressure, it does not recirculate. Air left on its own, though, is not compressible, mostly, forgive me for those of you who are engineers. It would rather not travel where there is denser static pressure. So it's easier for the air to circulate than not. And at the ends of the rotor system, these are massive. Those vortexes are massive out of ground effect. In fact, only the center of your disk is providing a lot of that lift. So a hover out of ground effect where you're not close to that low pressure air near the ground will not destroy any of your vortices, and it takes a lot of power. That's why sometimes you'll see those police helicopters hovering over San Diego for a long period of time, but not forever. They'll have to move out and kind of do a slow loiter eventually, just to save gas and to make sure that they're not going to have a low oscillation time. But you can do it if you do it right. Woe to you, though, if you don't hover with a zero rate of descent. And that's what happened, unfortunately, to some of our brave B-22 pilots. If you have a rate of descent on while hovering out of ground effect, those vortices get dangerous indeed. So next. And I think we got that. The Vortex ring state is what's that called. Now, do we have that little toy that we were throwing around, the little water weenie? Here, or no. Oh, darn. That was my...
I thought it was up with the...
I think maybe so. I did. Huh? Maybe I left it up there. Yes, it's in the corner. So everybody try and catch this one. This acts a little bit like a toroid of air. It's hard to hold on to. It would rather actually fold in on itself. It's full of liquid and a gel. So pass that around and see if you can hold it. Those things we actually used to sell in the gift shop. A toroid, there you go, I love it when they drop this. You can't hold it. A toroid is just, it's a ring that allows itself to have that surface recirculate. And that's what that is. So holding on to it, Chris is having a hard time too. It's a bear! It would rather recirculate than have you grip it. Now, air has a certain viscosity, and I'm glad Fred George is here, because he can tell me what that viscosity was to it fairly well. But that it would rather attach itself to the air outside with its static pressure and continue rolling than it will dissipate. This vortex wants to stay there. If you've got power on this rotor, you may get a set of two vortices, little donuts of air, inside each rotor system. And that means that all of the energy is spent roiling this donut of air. Those donuts of air, remember I told you they'd rather keep steady and move? Well, that's where the next thing comes in. So forgive me right away. Let's see if this works. Did anybody feel that one? Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. Let's see if we can. If you've ever seen these things, oh, no wonder there's a helicopter inside it. Some of you have seen these, and they'll put little blasts of smoke in there, and they'll actually knock your hat off sometimes. And the vortex of air actually would rather stay together than it would dissipate, and it'll travel for 50 yards, some of these things. You can even get them bigger. Well, while it's doing that, the helicopter will fall with that vortex completely through the air and without supporting itself at all. At 3,000 and 4,000 feet per minute, if you don't look out. If you get right in that vortex ring state, you can really get yourself in trouble. So helicopter pilots know to avoid that. What you're avoiding is low to moderate rates of descent with a zero forward wind speed. So it could be that you're moving forward, but with a tailwind and you don't notice it. You'll get a vibration, and that's it. Let's hit next again, and it'll probably tell us the 3 strikes that helicopter pilots look to avoid. One more time. Some call it power settling or settling with power. Those are old terms. Let's back up one more. Sorry. But the 3 strikes you're looking for are a high power setting, a low to moderate rate of descent, and a zero relative wind. If you've got that, you feel a vibration, and your increased rate of descent is sudden. You have to get out of it. And one of the ways you can do that is simply auto-rotating, but that requires a certain amount of vertical space. Not everybody gets that. There are other ways of doing it too. The Europeans have studied this extensively. You can actually try and move your cyclic a little bit to the left, push in opposite power, raise, take off power, try and break the ring. But once again, you lose up to 500 feet if you try that. So you have to be real careful. Plus, if you're fully developed, the cyclic doesn't work. Now you're stuck with a stick that doesn't seem to do anything. Wouldn't that be a nightmare? So only the collective will save you. If you can dump the collective to zero pitch and dive out of this thing from fully developed vortex ring state. You can be fine. But you don't want to get into it at low altitudes because you'll impact before you can recover.
How do you get into
That's
it?
what happened to our V-22 guys. Yeah.
How do you get into it?
Once again, low to moderate rates of descent for most helicopters, 300 to 800 feet per minute. Very low forward airspeed, or low or zero forward airspeed to the actual air, and fairly high power setting, so high pitch on the blades. That means that you're going to hold those vortices. My understanding is that getting sideways out of this is actually an option for those who know how to recognize it early. Yes, sir.
President, do they think that's what happened to the V-22?
To one of them, yes.
One in Nepal?
Yes. Oh, to Nepal? No, I don't know. Sorry, I don't know now. I know it happened during testing some years back. The vortex ring state also approached a little differently for the V-22, so they were watching for it, but they weren't watching for it when they got it. And that stood me by surprise. Yeah,
Is there any instrumentation using some feedback as to what's happening?
yeah, and mostly it's, well, I imagine it would be your VSI, vertical speed indicator, would be your biggest one, because you'd suddenly see it, but you'll also get a seat of the pants feel. And also there's a vibration that's an onset of that, normally, because you'll suddenly get the vortices starting, and that's a different airflow from what you're used to. So having not been in it myself, as far as I know, I don't know what the actual feeling is, but we were always told to look out for it. We were always told to look out for it. So, yes, sir.
How do you get enough forward speed, like just tipping?
Well, if the stick isn't working, you'll have to auto-rotate first and then get out of it.
No, I don't mean just getting out.
Oh, I just did it?
Yes.
You
I
simply
just want to
tip
go
the rotor disc.
140 miles an hour.
Absolutely. You're going at zero. You tip that rotor disc. The helicopter initially wants to follow it because it's hanging from your disc, but it'll settle out. And as that disc is tipping forward, the airflow will then begin to be taken from the front instead of around it. And you'll lose those vortices around your rotor disc, and suddenly it picks up dramatically. Anybody been in a helicopter that moved forward? You get a slight shudder, and they call it translational lift. And then you move forward with alacrity. It'll actually accelerate really quickly. And you have to avoid climbing at that point. You can lower your nose even more, and that's why helicopters look like they're practically standing on their prop. But once you tilt it, and you get past the point of what they call translational lift, where you lose your vortices, it really does accelerate quickly. Yes, sir.
I was with AC4 and we used to carry mail along with troops. And if you had 3 packs of mail, you could only cut it back maybe 1 or 2 because of the temperature.
That's exactly right.
And
If you've been, that was in country where it's hot,
Yes.
it's humid, and helicopters heavy. If you've ever read the book Chicken Hawk, some of you might have, or some of the others, frequently helicopters want to actually gather a little speed in translation lift before they even leave. And some of them, if they're in the landing zone, instead of lifting into a hover and taking off, it's not possible. They'll actually rotate into a circle to get out. You've seen that. It looks like a dog waiting to settle down, but in reality, they're just gaining a little speed, and then they climb, because they don't want to have all the power use that a hover requires. Otherwise, they'll settle right back down when they settle down. Very good. Next up. Thanks. V-22, amazing thing. Now, microburst vortexes are the same thing. If you get a microburst, that sudden downdraft that they warn pilots about all the time, it'll form vortices on the outside, and those stay remarkably together for a long period of time. And that's one reason why they warn pilots about it, because you can have a sudden updraft here as you're approaching a microburst, and then what have you got on the other side of the vortex? And this is when you are suddenly lowering your power and maybe even lowering your nose. And that downdraft will smack you into the ground. Or if you're hitting it sideways, turn you, maybe even upside down. So microbursts, everybody says, yeah, look out for them. But when they hit, they can be real wicked, because that toroid, that donut of air, wants to stay in. And those donuts of fluid pressure are everywhere in nature. Let's hit the next one. They actually happen a lot. Some of the cetaceans. Palm falls as a cylinder, spreads as a torus. Spreads as a deadly donut. And one more time. Here's some other vortex rings. You get the cetaceans like dolphins and this beluga whale. They'll blow a little water ring and then blow air into it. And they just watch it. That's kind of fun. It travels through the water. Here's a BBC air cannon. They actually ignite a little bit of smoke in there, and they blow these huge smoke rings for hundreds and hundreds of yards. They use it on those. Humpback whales will form bubble rings sometimes. And here's Mount Etna with a marvelous smoke ring. That's Mount Etna pushing a little piece of the smoke out when it gave a little puff. And that torus is staying up there 1,000 feet above the mountain. So it happens all the time. Of course, Jack Nicholson blowing his own with the torus right up there. So, I haven't smoked a cigar in a long time. It makes my mouth burn just to see it. Now, why is there no Mach 1 helicopter? That one's easy. And if the visitors ask you docents, it's just a function of the blades. This was an idea for a helicopter drone where they'd have a symmetrical airfoil back and forth, but then turn that into a regular wing, just stop it in mid-flight by having the little bit of angle of attack on the front and rear wings, let it glide a little bit once it gains speed, stop the whole wing, turn it off, and let it act as wings later on.
What could go wrong with that?
What could possibly go wrong? Exactly. Now, this is an idea that people will pursue, and there's one called X-Wing where they were doing that too, I've understood, but you can probably find more on Google. But they haven't done it with regular helicopters because they work well for what they do anyway, and you've already got supersonic aircraft to do the fast-moving stuff. But helicopters don't want to go supersonic by nature, because the rotor disc actually has one fast blade already, and you want to limit it to subsonic speeds. The advancing blade, this is a rotor system, American rotor system, going counterclockwise as you look down on it. The advancing blade on this H60, or this Apache apparently, is actually going 400 miles an hour at the tip, plus however fast this rotor system is going, up to 200 miles an hour or more. So it's really going fast. The retreating blade, not so fast. What if it was going 400 miles an hour at the tip? And you're going 200 miles forward? Now it's a 200-mile airfoil, and it has to actually produce more lift because right about here is the effect. Remember we talked about dynamic precession, or phase lag? So here's where the pitch change takes effect, right about here. And here is where the actual pitch change is paying off, pushing the aircraft forward. Bingo, right there you're going to have the blade stall. They call it retreating blade stall. And if you get much beyond 200 miles an hour, you're subject to it. In fact, in some cases, in my old helicopter, you could get blade stall considerably less. I've got a story on that one. So let's hit the next slide. You can see here, it's just the same slide. Oh, we'll have to keep going. Down again. Advancing blade, retreating blade, one more time. Or see, this is why we can't have Airwolf. And then the next one, oh, it disappeared. Oh, there it is. So you've got a remarkable forward vector on this blade, but the linear speed of this one is minus the velocity. It's the rotor speed minus the velocity of the helicopter. So it's going to have to take a much bigger bite of air. And because of that, it has a much bigger angle of attack, and therefore it's subject to stall and separation very early. Next. Thank you. So everybody who's seen the movies where the helicopters go supersonic, ain't going to happen. Once the wing is just a rotary wing, once it gets too big of a bite of air, suddenly you'll get those vortices again, destroying lift on the outside. Now suddenly you have static pressure or more on the top, and less than static pressure underneath, or it'll cancel out with the pressure as you're doing underneath, and you'll get zero lift out of that piece. The net result for an American helicopter is a pitch up and a roll to the left. But you'll see it coming. You'll get vibrations and noise, and it'll feel like all hell before it happens. So there's a lot of warning to that, and ideally, even if you do get it, if your helicopter stays together, which most of them will, it'll be self-recovering, because as you pitch up, the airspeed comes off. And the airspeed comes off, and you'll probably lower collective as well, and your blades will take less of a bite. So yeah, kind of fun, but we are on the lookout. Yes, I have run into that at 90 knots in an H-3 helicopter, because we were so heavily loaded, and I just got tired of watching the cars on Route 1 beating me on the way up. We were fighting a headwind, and I'm like, we can get more out of this. So I'm the lead of the flight, and I'm at the ragged edge of blade stall, and I got the vibration, a little tuck, and I go, let's bleed it off a couple of knots. So I did it perfectly, until we got close to Alameda. And then we got a slight downdraft, and I raised collective, and that raised our speed. And then we got a slight updraft, and I lowered collective, and I thought maybe we can go even faster. My whole helicopter pitched up, we tore a blade pocket, and I lost a day repairing. So yeah, you can actually hurt your helicopter if you get into that. Retreating blade stall is no joke. Imagine now retreating blade stall with a coaxial rotor system like the Russians use. Oh boy. So yeah, you might get the blades blending into each other at that point. So the Russians are still cautious. They have tremendous forward speeds on those helicopters, but they're still cautious of the retreating wind still.
Are they going in different directions?
Yes, they are. And therefore, slightly different planes of the tip paths. Okay, next one. That really covers it. There are traditional things that everybody sees. Oh yeah, by the way, whenever you see this in the diagrams, like we always used to get in our 11th grade, they're kind of lying to you. That's what an airfoil looks like in a wind tunnel. The real airflow would normally go down at the trailing edge of each airfoil. And everybody knows that. That's why you have wingtip vortices behind you, settling. So normally you'd want to expect, if you have a really good diagram, it'll show it going slightly down at the trailing edge of the wing. Unless it's in a wind tunnel, then it can't go down. Free air is purely incompressible, and it won't go down because the rest of the air won't let it. Let's go down here. All of those diagrams they showed us in high school are wrong. Now, this guy looks like he's in trouble. In reality, he's fully acrobatic, and he's just firing off flares. So that's kind of cool. I believe that's actually an Apache. Helicopters, they can get into trouble in different ways. And some of them actually are things that we're trained for, and some of them are just the fact of the nature of the beast, because there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of airflow. Next slide. One of the ways you can get into trouble is you can actually roll yourself over trying to take off. If you've got one skid or even a wheel tucked into the ground, a lot of people say, well, let's just lift off and get out of the way. But a helicopter has a lot of top hamper. The blades on top are actually pretty heavy. So your moment of mass is actually sideways if you lift. If you lift up, you're stuck to the ground. So if you've got something either tied into the ground or stuck in the mud, or even just got a sideways tire that's stuck there, and you lift a lot of power without getting that thing free first, you won't lift before you'll turn. You'll actually turn first. And that means you'll tumble and bad things happen. Let's hit that again and see if this GIF works. I think it will. Rolling motion when the power is applied. The safest thing to do if you notice you're rolling as you lift off is simply lower your collector and say, let's get unstuck. And make sure that you can't do it. The temptation is to just want to break free. And you don't want to do that without getting a motion against the side. So you really want to be careful. Next. Now here's a guy who got stuck with the skin on the ground, and he pulls power instead of lowering it. And so it'll turn over every time. I turn these into GIFs. I don't have my friend here because they're so easy to embed in a PowerPoint, whereas a regular video you have to actually link to a separate video, and sometimes that hurts. So yeah, this is what not to do, but at least you got the door open, you see that? Okay. Next, it's uncomfortable to watch. This is an H3, my beloved mount, but when you lose your tail rotor, that's bad too. And when do you lose your tail rotor? When you're applying more power to the gearbox, and the gearbox has a problem in it. Chip lights, for instance, there are little warnings in the cockpit that tell you when you've got flakes of metal in your gearboxes. They're serious. He might have had a chip light. This is only a few years ago, about 10 years ago or so, 13 years ago. And I suspect he had a chip light, so he's trying to cut into the ship where he's landing. It would have been better on an aircraft carrier where he could just kind of grease it on, but he doesn't have much room, so he applies a lot of power. And once he did, the tail rotor gearbox apparently failed, and he's spinning sideways. This did not end well. They lost the helicopter for him. They got out, but they lost the helicopter. And that's why the tail rotor is very important, and you don't see large, heavy helicopters backing into the trees, because we don't want that tail rotor to get anywhere near the instructions or the lines. Next up. So in the movies, they always lose a tail rotor because they can show that remarkable ground resonance. This is called ground resonance. If you've got yourself chained to the ground and you have a bad vibration, it's then amplified by however much harmonic motion you have. So if you've got an up and down or a sideways motion and you change yourself, then the sine wave has no bottom and it'll increase on the top. And this helicopter is an H-47 shaking itself to death. It's a famous sequence. They did this on purpose. All right, there's no man there. And they just wanted to see what would happen to this old perfectly good H-47 being ruined just to see what ground resonance looks like. But when you see helicopters that are chained down, they have to be real careful that they're chained down properly and that there's no vibration, one-to-one vibration as you touch down. If there is, you lower power immediately, shut the whole thing down, because otherwise you can shake yourself apart. So that's one of the things that helicopter pilots look out. Next up. And that's really it. The helicopters themselves are robust now. They're a lot more powerful thanks to turboshaft engines. The whole engine that supported myself and 2 other students and an instructor on the cross country in the H-57 Sea Ranger, the Jet Ranger, is about the size of a lawnmower engine. It's not much bigger. And we used to have one downstairs. It doesn't look like much. When you see that little turbo shaft, you don't think of it as being as powerful as it is, but they are. And all they have to do is then transmit that to the gearbox into torque, and provided you don't stop the rotor system, you don't stop the engine, you get remarkable amounts of power out of it. It's worth the extra fuel to use. The first helicopter I flew was the H-3, famous Helicopter 66 here, from my old unit, HS4. And it's still remarkable. If we had the choice, we probably would have built more of them instead of shifting over to the Seahawk, which we did. But the Black Hawk was already being built here in the United States, so what we did is we simply gave it bigger gas tanks, and we moved the tail wheel forward at the time. Now we're moving back to the tail wheel and back again. But moved the tail wheel forward, and we turned that into my second mount, which was a strike rescue helicopter. So before I was anti-submarine warfare, search and rescue. Then we became combat search and rescue and special ops delivery. That's my unit HCS-5. That's HS-5, but that's an HCS-5 bird. Why? The regular Navy did not buy those helicopters at first. So there's a little interesting for you. The reserves did. I was one of the active reserves. I helped train the reservists and keep them going. I know, I bailed out of the regular Navy. It was fun, and I didn't go to sea as much. But they still needed these, so we loaned them to them, and it actually worked. So you saw them actually operating in Desert Storm with both reserve pilots and regular Navy pilots, which is the way to go. These things are remarkably capable, and they're still conventional. It's just a tail rotor helicopter. Just a tail rotor helicopter. There was no need for anything different. Those things, this was the speed record holder when it came out. And it's still a hot helicopter, but the way we load it up, let's face it, the military does it, it was limited to about 120 knots. We were limited to about 140 in our Seahawks. We could have gone a little faster if we were light, but we were never light. As it was, we would outrun the Cobras that we were working with frequently in our exercises, because they would be heavy and they had a 2-rotor system. There's other things that are there. If anybody's heard of mast pumping, that's a 2-rotor system problem. But most of the time, the visitors will ask you, how come there's no air rule? How come there's no supersonic helicopter? How come helicopters don't stay in the air all day out of ground effect? Those sorts of questions I hope we've answered here. Have you got any questions from the back? Pretty straightforward. You guys have been great. Yes, sir, Chris.
Well, the new aircraft have the turned up wingtips?
You know, you mean the fixed wing aircraft? Yeah, that actually helps to destroy the wingtip vortex and gives you the effect of a longer wing without having to have a longer wing. So for helicopters, that would be a hard thing to keep because you've got a lot of angular momentum, and that would probably tend to spread winglets or make it a stress point. So what they did instead, I've got the earlier slide, is they swept the tips slightly on some of those, and it allows you to have a very high tip speed without necessarily going supersonic at the tip, kind of like a swept wing jet. And it also allows you to get a little bit more of what they call a low inertia rotor head. You can actually speed it up a little bit.
Are they allowed to have autopilots? Can you have an
Oh
autopilot?
yeah, we had a great autopilot. As I mentioned, you know, they actually get real steady. We did instrument flying in the H-3. I was the actual instrument guru of Commandant Airpack. That was fun. And when we were training people, they got so used to the steadiness of this helicopter that when they moved back to a smaller helicopter, that was hard. You know, these things are very steady in forward flight, and they trimmed out. This was worse. It actually was not only steady, but the autopilot was so good that you could get yourself out of balanced flight because it would rigidly hold heading and airspeed at the cost of balanced flight if you didn't look out. Later they fixed that problem, and it became a very, very good instrument.
Can you hover in autopilot?
Yes, you can. Ask this man right here. What did we call such hovers back in the day?
Penalty hovers?
Penalty hovers, you could do that too. Yeah, they were coupled hovers. What we do is we'd actually let the radar altimeter lock onto a section of the water, and you could actually sense the Doppler shift left and right, and it would correct itself. It would put inputs into the mixing unit electronically. And even in the 70s, this would hold a hover over the water at night with interfering nobody at the control. You didn't want to do that, but it was one of those things that you could do.
If you had, oh sorry, go ahead, Mark.
I was a helicopter pilot, about the right seat, needs to be the left leg.
You know, I don't know. Gordo?
Mr. Sikorsky is left-handed. That's exactly how that happened.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, there's always a reason. It's like, why did the famous chefs in France always cut the ends off of the lamb shank before boiling it? They finally had to ask why. And finally, we went to Maman, who said, well, dear, unless you cut the ends off the lamb shank, it won't fit into that pot your father gave. So there's always a reason. Yes, sir.
If you had some advice to give a young, aspiring helicopter pilot, something they should watch out for.
Right. Well, I've given the watch outs a little bit, but my advice, if anybody who wanted to fly, is to fly fixed wing first. That's the way the Navy does it. Fixed wing aircraft are much more efficient and cost effective than flying hours. So if you get flying under your belt, flying is flying. You have a little bit of situational awareness, decision making, control. If you can fly and you're not nervous about flying, you should be a little nervous at all times when flying. But if you can fly and it doesn't unsell you, then go into helicopters. I forgot to mention that. I should probably put average cost hour. That cost hour for a helicopter flight hour is tremendous. Look at all those moving parts. You know, getting a Cessna used to be in the 80s a question of about $50 an hour. Now a helicopter, Jet Ranger, at that same time was up to $500 an hour. I mean, that's a small helicopter. You can only hold the same people. So I don't know what it is now, but you're talking in order of magnitude, aren't you? And so people say, oh yeah, let's get a helicopter. Well,
Probably whatever the French are charging to rescue.
Yeah, like what the French are charging for rescue, exactly. According to the fabled Wikipedia, which I trust in this regard, if you're willing to spend that much just for a rescue, I'll bet you they're not recovering all their money yet. Because, you know, they've got the readiness and the training and that sort of thing. It's just kind of recoup. Yes, sir.
For some of us that are certified by the FAA as either as A&Ps and or as advanced instrument ground instructors with pilot certificates and so on, we wanted to get into the basic aerodynamics and then eventually get into the engineering part of aerodynamics of helicopters. Is that available online rather than having to, let's say, went down to Barnes and Noble or some JC bookstore and have to spend $100 or $200 on a book?
Well, don't spend $200. The best book I read was one.
That's just an example.
But yeah, there are some online courses out there, and some of them are free on YouTube videos. And that's a great place to start if you're just interested. But also the book, Prudy's Helicopter Aerodynamics from the 70s and 80s. It was the one the Navy used to make their text. It's really quite good. Now, some of the terminology is a little older, but it's not too deep. It's good for psych majors as well. And that's, I think we have it upstairs. I believe we have it upstairs. So a good place to start might be upstairs. We teach at ground school, as you might know, Part 61 ground school, but we don't do rotary wing on it here at the museum. We actually farm it out to General Atomics. But the basics of aerodynamics in a regular pilot ground school they're so basic as to me. They would almost insult you as an engineer. They just brush over it, you know, Bernoulli, left, low pressure, go. And then the rest of it is what you need to know to go fly. So,
Where is that helicopter motor you were telling us about, the turbo?
there was a turbo shaft helicopter motor. It's probably out of Gillespie now. That was the same one that was in the Jet Ranger. I hope we haven't got rid of it. I don't know where it is now.
It was
in the basement.
It was in the basement. I think it might still be.
Might still be there? That would be nice to see. Yes, sir.
You know, the 34, you had to track the blades by hand. So I was told when I went to Cayman School on cooking that they were the first one that automatic tracking devices. Is this true?
Well, I've heard
Cayman was the first one.
I've heard that Cayman Command actually needed all the help they could get. So scientific,
I'm not going there.
Scientific Atlanta did make tracking devices later for my helicopter, and I had been told that those automatic tracking devices were made for the H-2.
Track them with a flag.
Yeah, a little tab on the end of the rotor, and then a strobe light.
No, we had ribbons on a flag.
Okay, that's different from what we got. Our tracking device was, in theory, what they call second generation. All it was we fired a high intensity strobe light, and we put tabs on the rotor system, and by changing the strobe light, shifting the period, not the frequency, you could find out which blade was in track and which was out of track. A very simple device. And you could then adjust the tabs on it, kind of get yourself back in line. So you wouldn't get a one-for-one vibration every time it came around. So,
In the Cayman H2, we had an automatic tracker where you could sit in the pilot seat and do it all automatically,
that's pretty cool.
but it broke often, so what we had to do is go out there with a broomstick and a piece of chalk on it, and you just keep going up until you feel a ting, turn the thing off, and you can see which is the
And that was the low blade.
That's the low blade.
The one that, you know, that's
People never would volunteer to do that.
That sounds so
Yeah, the
Russian,
thing
doesn't
with
it?
the legs, remember you
Hold
said
the stick up until you feel impact. That is the low blade. The one with the yellow paper on the blue stick. Now I'm lying. It's simple. That's probably, you know, an elegant way to do it. Of course, here we have this whole scientific Atlanta set and we plugged it. Bernie.
On development of the Osprey, were you involved with?
Not at all. We wanted to get the Osprey for combat search and rescue because it would carry 2 sticks of troops and a survivor out. But it morphed into something a little bit bigger and more expensive than the Navy was willing to buy at the time. I understand they're still considering it. But the H-60, the Rescue Hawk, which is my bird, is now old. So they're getting the newer birds to do multi-roll material. And so you'll see something that looks like this, but the tail wheel's further back, it's got the extra equipment on it, and they'll just be able to do it all. You know, not perfectly, but they'll be able to do it all. Meanwhile, the Osprey is huge. It's huge. So,
in the beginning, when they were developing it, there was a little controversy between the helicopter drivers and the fixed-wing drivers. You know, what are we going to do? Is it going to be a...
Helo drivers lost.
Huh?
The Helo drivers lost. That was my...
And it was a very sorry result.
You know, they got it to work, and no other nation on earth has, so we win. You know, and a lot of times, there are some of those infighting controversies you hear in the helicopter community. Why are there no Navy attack helicopters on frigates? Because we already have helicopters we can turn into attack helicopters now. And when we needed them, the Army guys were just fine. So, you know, we had assets there. And sometimes you can solve it with the simplest thing. And it turns out that fixed-wing pilots who got the Osprey, more or less, they're spending a lot more of their time flying like an airplane than they are like a helicopter. And so they were finally saying, you know, the helicopter part is only a small portion of what we do. And we were arguing, gee, it's the critical part. But that kind of wore out. Right now, if you ask an Osprey pilot what he is, he's a powered lift Osprey pilot. He's not a fixed-wing pilot. He's not a helicopter pilot. He's a powered lift pilot. And fiercely proud of it. We had them here a couple of years ago. You may remember. Finally, the guy was starting to be cutting in and said, let me give this a lecture.
Are there any considerations beyond what you've covered today that would apply to the supergiant Russian helicopters?
Yeah, you know, I don't know for sure. The ones that we saw, that I talked to, and Gordo may have some more info on it, they were well done with those tandem rotor systems, that one on top of another.
No, I mean like the Mi-26.
Oh, the H-26. Yes, there are some considerations. The engineers already knew that there was lateral stress on the actual airframe and on the gear shafts between them, because they have to actually be, as you know, the engines run both the front and the back rotors. He's talking H-46 and H-47.
No, I meant the Russian, the Mi-26.
Oh, the Mi-26.
The Helo or something like that.
Oh, okay. Those great big ones, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a limitation on simple material size. If you guys are all familiar with Langley's aerodrome versus Wright. Once you upsize something, it becomes significantly different in essence, and that's what happened to the V-22 as well. When we upsized the tilt rotor from a smaller test bed, it actually became a different engineering problem in many ways. The same thing happened to the large helicopters that the Russians built. They needed them. They didn't have many roads or railroads out in the hinterlands, so they wanted enormous lift helicopters. They found the maximum size of a helicopter without breaking aluminum parts apart. And remember, they're older now, so they're not using composites. But they simply got to that size and said, this is about it, no more. After that, the whole structure begins to fall apart. You know, and remember we told you about how fast the tip path is going? Roughly 400 miles an hour for a fast helicopter. Because any more than that, if you were going 200 miles an hour, you might get supersonic tips eventually. Well, think of how large those rotors are in the Helo. They're going progressively faster. The inside of their rotor system doesn't work very well. It takes too big of a bite out of the air. So there's a limit to how much you can get out of a rotary wing just by increasing it. You don't get a Davis wing, rotary wing. It just won't hold together torsion-wise. They may be able to do better with composites now, but the Russians are doing just fine on their own. That's a remarkable helicopter. We like the H-53 a little better, but you know, we're pretty, how shall I say, we're conservative. Well, that was marvelous. Yes, sir.
Why aren't the blades wider at the tip?
They are in some. They are in some. But remember also that angular momentum, what the uninitiated would call centrifugal force, it's a pretty good word, will mean that you have more stress on the outside and less on the inside. So you want the inside of the rotor disc to do some of the work if you can. Especially at low speeds, it's fine. At high speeds, the inside of the rotor disc kind of stalls out. Well, thanks for coming, guys, and I hope you enjoyed. We'll see you next time, probably the third Monday.